Welcome to a fantastic edition of Rebellion's educational series. I'm here with David Way, Chief Curator and Historian of the mighty USS Iowa, one of the legendary U.S. ships, one of the 4 Iowa-class battleships named for her. David, thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Our staff loves sharing Iowa's history and information that we've learned. We love sharing with everybody.
So first, give our viewers an idea of how big the ship was. How many meters long is she? How big was her crew during World War II?
Sure. I don't do meters, but she's 887 feet long. If she was still in service today, her and her 3 sister ships, she would be, besides aircraft carriers, the largest surface ships afloat, and also besides the amphibious assault mini carriers, which I call them. Her beam is 108 feet, which allowed a foot clearance, port and starboard, in the original Panama Canal. And with a full load of fuel and 16-inch projectiles, displacement wise, about 57,000 tons. It varies over her years of service. And there's 19 levels and decks inside the ship. In World War II, with a massive amount of anti-aircraft guns that they brought on board the ship, her crew complement swelled up to about 2,800. Her second commissioning, it was reduced a little bit down to 2,400. And during the Cold War, the 1980s era, it was still about 1,400. And I always compare that to the Burke class destroyers, which are the backbone of the fleet today. They have about 300, 320 in their crew normally. So still 5 times the normal crew complement. And she was designed in 1938, so not very automated at all, as you could imagine.
She was built to deal with the growing issue of Germany and Japan.
Right, right. When she was being designed in 1938, there was a great fear in the U.S. Navy of what was taking place in Japan with their battle cruisers and battleships. We knew that they had been upgraded and modified. There was some vague rumors about some super battleship that initially the Navy didn't believe. And there was one point in time where they had to make a decision: do we build more aircraft carriers? But the Navy determined that they didn't want to get caught flat-footed, being outgunned. And traditionally, in the Navy, you always have to have a big battleship. So they went ahead and started construction on, initially, of course, New Jersey and Iowa. Iowa came out in a remarkable 32 months. They were working 7 days a week, 12-hour shifts, and New Jersey shortly behind her. Missouri and Wisconsin came out a little bit later.
David, you make a great point, which makes me wonder, had Japan flanked their carriers with significant battleships during Midway, do you think Japan would have been able to win the battle and not lose 3 different carriers?
By that time, air power really had taken over the strategic striking arm of the Navy. And in fact, when the Midway battle took place, Illinois and Kentucky, the 5th and 6th Iowa class battleships that were being built, they were just put on hold because it was very obvious that air power had taken over, again, the strategic striking arm of the Navy. In fact, Iowa, during World War II, she spent the majority of her time as a fast battleship, because they were the fastest class battleships ever commissioned, about up to 33 knots. They were escorting the fast striking aircraft carrier task force groups. And it was mainly because they had a massive flak battery. Iowa's had 52 20 millimeter guns, 19 quad 40 millimeters, and then the 10 twin 5-inch gun mounts. They were dual purpose.
Exactly. David, we had the designer of the USS Gerald Ford, the recent aircraft carrier, on the show. And he said the one point he's always faced is some people saying you built a floating target. And so, how important is it for the battleship to defend the aircraft carrier? And going back to Midway, had Yamato not been hundreds of miles away and had she been defending Akagi and the other 2 carriers, do you think they would have stayed afloat?
Midway was such a quirky mix of timing and luck and the fog of battle, as I always talk about. I don't know, that's really debatable. One of the other thoughts I've had is the reason they kept Iowa's, the fast battleships around the aircraft carriers was if the planes were gone and if you'd exhausted your carrier aircraft patrol group, your air umbrella, and some, big gunships did manage to get close to the aircraft carriers, then you did, were able to fall back on the big guns of a battleship to protect your task force group, your aircraft carriers. And so perhaps, that could have made a difference.
I mean, isn't that the thinking of Russia? And that's why Russia still builds gigantic battle cruisers, ones that are
Well,
far larger than ours.
yeah, after the Cold War, I mean, that's all that they were left with. I mean, a lot of their ships, they're just now starting to bring more modern ships aboard, but they were left with whatever they built. And they went through a phase where I don't think they had much money to spend on
Yeah, I
upgrading.
know they went from 800 or 600 submarines to
Sure.
20 at one point that they could actually afford to put
Right.
gas into. So
Right.
yeah,
Right.
no, I mean,
And
the Kursk was a defining moment. Absolutely.
sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Definitely.
returning back to the Iowa. So can she fire all three of her turrets at once?
Yes, but the way they're designed is the gun barrels fire left, right, and center about a split second. Uh, and that allows the blast pressure to dissipate just a little bit.
Hmm.
And so you're not going to knock off your aiming of the gun barrel and also the projectile. And if you look really carefully at some of the photographs, um, aerial views looking down, you can see that one gun is firing and recoiling. You could just barely see, they do recoil almost 4 feet, 47 inches. So they do have this timing to release the pressure or not cause so much back force, I guess you'd say. There's also pictures I have from the 1980s where not only are the 16-inch guns firing a broadside, but the 5-inch guns at the same time. And there's this, of course, huge flame ball that's striking out the 16-inch gun barrels throughout a flame about 300 feet. So it's, of course, very impressive, as you well know.
And in terms of the aim, the vibration of being an ocean cruiser, that didn't really affect the gun.
No, no, like at a high speed. No, I don't believe so. In World War II, Iowa was noted. She straddled an escaping Japanese destroyer, the Milwaukee, when they were sweeping through a truck, and they straddled her at 22 miles. So the gun range is realistically, you're not going to go much more than 23.
Iowa does have
miles.
the world record, right, for projectile range.
Yes, during the 80s, they were trying to see what the different powder bag weights they could change out. And she had a record shot of a 26 point, I think it was 8 miles.
That is a marathon. Yeah.
Yeah. And hit the target as well, the target area.
Wow.
So, yep, that's true.
No, that's super impressive. And there are no gigantic compartments, right? It's all lots of little mini compartments so that pieces can be blown off and she'll stay afloat.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very much honeycombed is the way I think of it. It's definitely not like cruise ships, ocean liners, or these big, volumes, and also not like an aircraft carrier where you have these huge hangar decks and open, of course, flight decks. And the largest compartments on Iowa are the officer's wardroom on main deck, and then also the enlisted galleys. But the rest of the ship is very honeycombed.
How nice is the officer's mess? I know on Tirpitz, the German battleship, the officer's mess is quite pretty with a piano and paintings.
Mm-hmm. So Iowa's was pulled out of her 80s refurbishment quicker. They were going to show up to relieve New Jersey that was off Lebanon and Beirut for a long time. So there was a lot of niceties, as I call it, that weren't incorporated into Iowa as there were on New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin. Just visual upgrades to like the officer's wardroom and the mess deck area. So Iowa's a much closer in her interior than she appeared as in World War II and the Korean War. And now it's just a interesting mixture of the World War II era and the 80s upgrades that took place. But I think
Interesting.
our ship, interior wise, comes closer to the original layout of a lot of the compartments.
When she was brought back for the Korean War, where she did most of her gunnery service, really, right?
Yes, yes. I managed to get a hold of the Korean War records, and I'd already picked up the World War II records and the war diaries. And just an interesting side note, as a historian, I was really appalled and shocked. Nobody had ever requested for the Korean War records to be opened up, to be used and reviewed for documentation, research, or whatever it might be.
That's insane. I
So,
couldn't believe that.
yeah, so I had to write a Freedom of Information Act letter. And I suspect the other three sister ships, nobody's done this as well. But anyhow, I wrote a letter and got the copies. And so they have a daily, diary, basically what took place in the ship, to the point where they counted, how many 16-inch rounds were fired, 5-inch rounds, et cetera, et cetera. So I've got that for 7 months. And the bottom line is she fired twice as many rounds in this 7-month period off the Korean coast than she did in all of World War II. And that just amazed me. And when they did bring out Iowa, there weren't too many changes, I believe, to her World War II configuration. Most of the 20 millimeter gun mounts had been removed because they were obsolete by that time. There was a mixture of some remaining quad 40 millimeter mounts, but everything else was pretty much World War II-ish.
What about air conditioning? Does she have any air conditioning?
No, that wasn't added until the 80s.
So how hot would the gunner, like the 16-inch gunnery men, how hot would they get during?
Well, I don't think, no more, I think, than the rest of the ship, because, most of the heat and flame and everything else is on the outside of the ship. Now, we were told by the World War II veterans when they were in the South Pacific, it was so hot that they would sleep on top of the decks, on top of the turrets, and maybe in the superstructure if they could, because it was just miserable down below decks. And I don't know how big of an issue that was during the Korean War. During the 80s, though, they did upgrade like the restroom, the head facilities, and also they did add a water cooling, swamp cooler type things that they still use today. And in the 80s, veterans said that it was fairly comfortable, and they had a lot less crew too, of course.
So how's the drinking water situation on the
drinking water?
Is there good ample drinking water? I know that often the ships have
I've never encountered that being a problem with their distillation plants. I don't think there was a shortage on that. I like to point out that the Iowa class battleships have some really unique features. They're expensive to operate and hard to justify in peacetime. But when they were in service, besides, of course, their great armor, their great speed, the massive gun power that they brought, they also they were almost like a tender. They carried so much fuel oil, they could refuel escorting ships, which they did quite frequently. They had massive food areas, so they would share their food. And also on board, they had a huge machine shop, so they helped with other ships' repairs if they could. Then they had on board a dental office and also a 26-bed hospital with surgeons. And they would bring on board, crews from escorting ships. So they brought a lot along with them. Again, expensive to operate, though, and hard to justify in peacetime is what I always say. So.
Yes, no, indeed. So.
Yeah.
So talk, FDR obviously was ferried around on Iowa. She was the presidential.
Yes.
Yeah. So how handicap accessible is she?
Today you're talking about?
Well, World War II time when FDR was on her.
Okay. What they did for President Roosevelt's much convenience as possible, and this brings up a little story as well. They added 2 elevators,
Hmm. I
and
did
it
not know
was
that.
a yeah, and they were on the exterior of the ship. And for the longest time, we had so many conflicting comments about how many elevators were on board the ship. There was one, two, three. They were inside. Uh, they were outside. And I finally ran across an unmarked picture of Iowa arriving at Tamirs El Kabir in North Africa. And it was an aerial view. And it was just in some weird Bureau of Air um, folder in the National Archives. And I didn't think much about it. I was scanning photographs like mad during my visit. And I got home and I zoomed in there, and oh my goodness, there were the 2 elevators. So the main elevator would take him from main deck up to the O1 level, and that's where he stayed in the captain's import cabin on the O1 level. And they created like a little veranda area outside there. And then he could get back into the elevator and go to the O2 level. And from there, they had the flag officers um, area inside. But also there was a smaller elevator that would take him from O2 to O3. And Iowa is unique. Her armored conning tower extends down to the O3 level. The O4 level is the bridge and the helmsman, and then the fire control people are in the O5 level. The other 3 Iowas don't have this armored section in the armored conning tower. So
Well,
there's about
can you tell our viewers about the armored conning tower and their?
yeah. Okay, so the armored conning tower kind of is like a big tube that sits in the middle of the superstructure. It's 17 inches thick of a Class B armor. The door that you close is like a bank vault, and that protected the helmsman. It's not that big of an area. It's only about 36 feet wide. But this goes back to the mentality of duking it out gun to gun in the warships. And you actually have little slits you look out of, and there's periscopes there too that extend up. So I was reminded of the wonderful book Steel Castles at Sea that was written, and how appropriately that was put when you
Love
sit
that.
inside this armored conning tower.
No, it does feel very Jutland inspired indeed.
Right, right. Then the other item that was installed for President Roosevelt was a bathtub for his convenience. That was another, I call them battleship urban myths that I had to unfortunately bring to everybody's attention. There was a big rumor that started for years and years, it still does, is that Iowa was the only American warship that had a bathtub installed, and that was not true at all. And then I just ran across just this last week, and I'm trying to find some more information. When President Roosevelt, towards the end of the war, went up to the Yalta Conference on board the cruiser Quincy, I read an article where the crew members knew something was afoot when they had a bathtub installed in the ship, and there was an elevator installed on the exterior. And they already kind of put 2 and 2 together. And then there were 2 boats that were modified for President Roosevelt. So a lot of people, got a little frustrated with me for bringing out the historical truth. They also wanted to say it was the only warship that had a bathtub installed by president, and now I've found out that's probably not true either. So anyhow, that was one of the things I ran across, and so I'm trying to tell the truth here.
So while I have you, do you think that it was a golden bullet that took out HMS Hood, or do you have a feeling about the Hood versus Bismarck showdown?
Oh boy. Yeah, well, Bruce Taylor, who I've interfaced with before, the author of the Naval Institute's book on HMS Hood. I'll never forget reading his book, and he mentions that the chief engineer on Hood pleaded with the captain of the Hood not to take her out to sea for this Bismarck watch, which ended up being an engagement, because he said the ship was just desperately in need of an overhaul. And of course, as you probably well know,
Not an experienced crew, yeah. Very
well, I think it was more mechanical is what he was worried about. There was so many issues.
Because I'd always read about the crew not being experienced, whereas the
Oh,
Bismarck crew was very experienced at the time.
oh, that could be true too. I wasn't
But,
aware of that. And then
but
the other thing, just before World War II started, well, if the war hadn't started, Hood was scheduled to go in for a major refit, and part of that was adding horizontal armor for just what ended up killing her was
no.
one of these plunging shots. So yes, it
What
was
about
a
what
good.
about Bismarck versus Iowa? Do you think Bismarck stands a chance against the mighty Iowa?
Right, right. I think America had the best fire control systems in
Yes,
World
fire
War II.
control was so underrated. Fire control was everything.
Yeah, and we actually have on board our ship the original battery plot rooms with the 1940 analog computers. And we have special tours on the weekends. They're called the gun tours. And we have a forward uh, battery plot and an aft battery plot, and they're totally intact.
Yeah.
It's absolutely wonderful. But I think that would have been the big difference. And also, our 16-inch 50 caliber guns, they had produced a 2,700-pound armor piercing shell that had as much impacting, destructive force as the 18-inch gun system. And I think even though Bismarck was wonderfully armored and had great optical fire control systems, I think the Iowas would have taken care of business, so to speak. So
Wonderful.
yeah.
Well, so tell us about the Iowa Museum. You're open 5 days a week, 7 days a week?
Yes, we're just, of course, coming out of the pandemic. We did try to stay open as best we could with an exterior tour because for a while there, we weren't even allowed to have people go inside the ship. So we're open 7 days a week from 10 to 4. We have mainly self-guided tours. We're still bringing back online, like different electrical systems and monitors and things of that nature. We have a couple of side tours people can take. The President's Tour, where we talk about President Roosevelt's trip on board Iowa. That's an extra item you can purchase. Also, just deck tours, guided tours with one of our trained staff and tour volunteers, about 2 hours long. And then on Saturday and Sundays, we have both a gun tour and also an engineering tour that are also about 2.5 hours long that are really fantastic. For the engineering tour, you get to go into the engine rooms and the boiler rooms, and all 4 of those are totally intact, just as the ship was decommissioned in 1990s. And we finally are allowed now to go into one of the 16-inch gun turrets, turret 1 for the gun tour, as well as down in the magazines and inside one of the twin 5-inch gun mounts. So that takes place on the weekends. We're mounting an effort to hopefully become the National Museum of the Surface Navy. We have a big fundraiser taking place for that. And we just are in the middle, or maybe already concluded, a big fundraiser for a whole preservation effort. We run an electrolysis field around the hull, and we try to do all the right things to maintain the ship.
Now,
for
salt
many
water
years.
is an annoying combatant.
I'm sorry?
Salt water is an annoying combatant for a museum ship.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. We actually have 2 cofferdams, and we were working on the wind water line, which gets the most wear and tear. So again, we're trying to do all the right things to for long-term preservation of the ship.
No. No, the Navy has a lack of museums, and I really hope over the next few years we see more museums being built for naval history. If for instance, the Pearl Harbor Museum is for me a life event. When I went there, I absolutely cried and was totally moved. And all of our battleships are these great American icons, and I think they should all be visited. And David, I really thank you so much for your time today. You're fantastic.
Oh, great. Anytime. You're always thrilled to share Iowa, like I mentioned earlier.
Well, I've got one last question before I let you go. Okay. I want to know your favorite naval battle of all.
Oh, gee. I've just enthralled to this day the 3 naval night battles that took place over Guadalcanal. They just were harrowing in my mind. And the one comment that always sticks in my mind, the battle was like, one of them anyhow, was like somebody turned off the lights in a bar, and it was a barroom brawl. And yeah, battleships and heavy cruisers just within a mile of each other, just
Yeah.
duking it out on a couple of occasions. And I'm dismayed that somebody still hasn't made a film about one of those naval night battles.
It was really the most battleship versus battleship battle of World War II. I mean, there were others, but that one was just so intense.
Right, right. Yeah, it just amazes me to this day. One of our tour volunteers, unfortunately, he's since passed, but he was on the Hull, HOEL, the destroyer hull during that engagement. Or is that the other one? Oh, I'm getting my ships mixed up. Scratch that. I think that might have been Lady Gulf I'm thinking of. Yeah. Okay. My mistake.
No, well, the night battles, November 14th, November 15th, Guadalcanal. Definitely, I agree. Absolutely amazing history. Really very, very, very cool.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of like it's got a little bit of a, Cape Matan when, was it when, HMS Warspite kicked up all the Italian boats, but
Sure.
nevertheless, yeah, great point, David. This was a lot of fun, and I really recommend all of our viewers in the West Coast to check out the USS Iowa and visit David there.
Yes.
David,
Right.
you have a wonderful weekend. Okay.
All right. Thanks again.
Our pleasure is all ours. Thank you, sir.
Great.